Okay. Welcome everyone, and thank you so much. Hello, Helena and Colleen. I don't know if we've met, or, but we'll do intros real quick, and you guys can tell us a little bit about yourselves. Yeah, so this is Journal Club. Started in Rockford, Illinois, a little town that most people don't know about, but has a long history that has its good share of brutality and racism in it. Perhaps it is not entirely surprising that this started there. The advisor for this group is Dr. Howard, an amazing and charismatic writer and activist who is attending from his hospital room. Yeah, and the intent today is to benefit from this incredible group of scholars and thinkers and learn with and from them about Fanon and his writings on violence and the wretched of the earth, and hopefully a little bit of the relevance as they and we see it to medicine and the medical industrial complex as it stands today. Real quick, if just Dr. Howard, Dr. Gordon, Dr. Turner, you guys could just say a little bit about yourselves and the work you've done, and kind of like what your, and if you could like speak specifically to the work you've done on Fanon and what you make of Fanon, briefly. We can start with Dr. Turner. That's okay.
Well, I'm at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I'm still trying to understand the College of Medicine at Rockford, or the School of Medicine at Rockford. My wife is actually an associate dean in the new College of Medicine here at the University of Illinois. Well, I go back quite a ways in my work with Frantz Fanon. I think probably when I was a senior in high school. So a lot of the work that I did was around the activism that I was involved in on college campuses and Fanon. In 1978, I co-authored a pamphlet called Frantz Fanon, Soweto, and American Black Thought at the time of the emergence of the Black consciousness movement in South Africa. Which brought apartheid, arguably, to an end. And the work of Steve Biko in relationship to Fanon's work. Since then, I've written a number of articles on Fanon as also a Hegel scholar and a Marx scholar. I'm interested in Fanon's relationship to Hegel and Marx. I think the thing that may have brought me, at least to you guys' attention, is that I just co-edited a book with counseling psychologist Helen Neville here at the University of Illinois on Frantz Fanon's psychotherapeutic approaches to clinical work, practicing internationally with marginalized communities. And it was in response to the publication, although there have been various iterations of the publications of Fanon's clinical papers and some unpublished work by him, including his dissertation. And so we collected from different parts of the world psychotherapists who were attempting to use Fanonian clinical practices in their work. So we think it may be a unique text, and mostly in relationship to maybe inspiring more work, more collections of actual practical applications of Fanon's therapeutic approach to mental health issues in different parts of the world. So that's kind of the latest work that I have done. Came out with Routledge Press actually at the end of last year, but the publication date is 2020. So that's kind of where I am today. Oh, I met in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning here at the University of Illinois. I was formerly in the Department of African American Studies here at the University of Illinois. I do a lot of work with communities in Chicago around community and economic development projects, do a lot of community engagement work, and I do some here in Champaign-Urbana.
Thank you so much, Dr. Turner. Dr. Howard, maybe you could go next. So if you want to get back to recovering and resting, you can do that.
Okay, so I actually, I have to say, I grew up in a very precarious working class family in rural Ohio. And I'm saying that just because my family's problems with health access actually more or less determined my whole medical career. So I've actually worked in primary care internal medicine, mostly based at community health centers and public hospitals in the U.S. and Latin America. And I'm officially emeritus from University of New Mexico, but have continued to work clinically and with teaching and activism in various ways that we can get into as it's relevant. Regarding Fanon, I actually first encountered Fanon's work as a medical student, first-year medical student, working with the Black Panther Party clinic in Boston, in Roxbury. And Fanon's work was influencing a number of people working at the clinic, and we studied it in that context. It was, and it was oriented toward his clinical work in addition to the revolutionary work that he favored. I could say since Lou mentioned it as well, that I've been strongly influenced by Marxism as well, and much of my efforts have been to apply Marxist analysis to problems in medicine and public health.
I think you have to unmute.
Oh, yeah, Dr. Gordon.
Well, hello, everybody. Yeah, I'm Louis Gordon. I see we have a short time, but rather briefly, I'm head of the philosophy department at the University of Connecticut, and I'm in a bunch of other units as well because of a lot of my work covers across the human sciences, and fundamentally questions of what it is to be a human being, what it is, what is freedom, and the complex questions of how do we justify any thought whatsoever. But my other appointments were, I was at Temple, where I created the Center for Afro-Jewish Studies, the Institute for Race and Social Thought, and I was a professor of philosophy there as well. I taught at Brown, where I founded the Africana Studies Department, and taught at a bunch of departments there. And Lou and I met when I was at Purdue.
At Purdue.
Yeah, when I was at Purdue, that we met 25 years ago there, yeah. When I was teaching philosophy and African American Studies. And additional things is I'm the honorary president of the Center for Global Studies, and I have an appointment as in the Unit for the Humanities at Rhodes University in Makonda, South Africa, and European Union Chair of Philosophy at Toulouse, a bunch of other stuff. The Fanon was first introduced to me actually when I was an adolescent, early adolescent, in fact. One of my uncles was a Rastafarian. You know, he's one of these people who bought a lot of books but didn't read them. And so there were all these books, and I loved reading. And there were all these books from Kwame Nkrumah, Amilcar Cabral, Fanon, etc. And I would read them and didn't understand them. But there's the thing about reading, I always say, when it comes to philosophical texts or great texts, you've never read them. You are reading them. So I'm still reading Fanon, just like, you know, as Lou brought up Hegel, you're still reading Hegel. But a lot of the political work that I was involved in stimulated from the company of jazz musicians. I'm also a jazz musician. And there's a lot about jazz musicians people don't realize. Jazz musicians' homes have books. Many jazz musicians, despite their dapper suits and their presence on the stage, were busy fighting for liberation all over the place, whether it's Aminata Moseka like Abbie Lincoln or Max Roach, all those people. Every jazz musician I knew from my period of growing up in New York in the 70s was involved in those activities, all the way through our work with varieties of Marxist organizations and our role in the anti-apartheid struggle. The scholarship stuff on Fanon, that came about actually through something that's linked to his medical work, although we think in terms of his political work. And that was in the 80s, I had founded a school in New York City for adolescents nobody wanted to teach. And the program, we were informed, would be successful if we only had 10% of them get a high school diploma. Anyway, we averaged 85%. And when you do that, the state wants you to make a study. Well, one of the things I noticed was that if you treat people like human beings, they grow. If you dehumanize them, if you don't respect their humanity, they wither. And I think that's one of the things that you'll find at the heart of Fanon's thought, especially his medical practice, about the establishment of a human relationship with the patient, and he makes a distinction between the patient and the client. That led me to go and continue my studies on the very question of what is involved in human potential. And eventually that brought me back to Fanon, but in a very different way, because I was then armed, as we could say, with a set of concepts through which to read him differently. And I began to learn from people like Lou and many others over the years. And the rest, in terms of scholarship, Lou and others, there is Fanon, a critical reader. I wrote a book called Fanon, the Crisis of European Man. I wrote a book called What Fanon Said, and did all kinds of other things, including co-founding the Caribbean Philosophical Association, where there's the France Fanon Awards. But anyway, that should give a sense of my background.
Thank you so much for those introductions. I do like, even if there's like a number of people, to just kind of like go around and have people like say something about, like, you can just say your name, just so we can start the meat of it. Say your name, say where you are, say what you're up to, and you know, anything about like why you're interested in Fanon or whatever. But try to keep it to like say 30, 45 seconds if you can. And I'll just like go based on like what I see. So Abe, you want to introduce yourself?
Oh, sure. I'm Abe. I'm a fourth-year medical student at the UIC College of Medicine in Rockford. I am currently in Rockford right now. I'm from DeKalb. And I'm just following the journal club because I think philosophy is important, and I just want to learn more about it, and when I can say what I think about it.
Thank you, Abe. Sagar and Will are also part of this effort to get this going. So Will, would you like to introduce yourself?
Of course. So my name is Chung Tai Tien. I am also a M4 at UIC Chicago. At UIC, Rockford. I am also currently in Rockford. Like Janith and I really started the whole thing You know, like we started this whole thing as a way to get people to talk about, you know, philosophical issues in medical school and like how really medicine as a whole plays a role in broader society. And I think at this particular moment where we're seeing an ever greater consciousness about race and class and like ever greater strains like in the superstructure of American society. Along those lines, as like neoliberalism kind of like begins to like crack, I think Fanon, as a person who actually like lived and fought through another like a period of decolonization and was a medical practitioner, is really, really relevant. And I think like anybody who is interested in medicine and like what role it plays in American society today cannot ignore what he has to say.
Thank you, Cheng Tai, for that resounding endorsement of our current conversation. Sagar?
Hello, I'm Sagar. I'm also a fourth year. Me, Will, and Denise kind of started Journal Club about 3 years ago, so we've been slowly building it up and getting more and more attendance, which is really exciting. Just want to thank Janith because he always manages to one-up himself and find a more eclectic group to join us. And excited for the discussion today.
Helena, I hope I'm saying that right.
Hi, I'm Helena. I'm a first year med school student at Chicago. I am currently on campus, and I only became interested or started to learn more about philosophy in the past few years. So I'm very much a beginner and a learner. So I'm here to really excited to hear what everybody has to share and learn from everyone.
Thank you so much for joining us. Colleen.
Hi, I'm actually in Australia. I'm a second year medical student at Sydney University, and American, but what I did learn here since moving to here is Australians like to start out by saying that the First Nations land that they're on, rather than saying I'm in Sydney, they'll say, I'm on the Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, which I think is like a really, I don't know, I just had never been taught that way in America. So I actually only got the invite to this meeting about 12 hours ago. So that was my first exposure to Fanon. I haven't finished the reading, to be completely frank about it. But I have an interest in colonization and how that affects mental health. I'm interested in psychiatry. And yeah, I've also had the privilege of, this is now my third country, like colonized country that I've lived in, growing up in the US, and I did Peace Corps in a very small country called Lesotho, and now living in Australia. So yeah, I'm just interested in the topic. Thanks.
Very cool. Thank you, Colleen. Shirley?
Thanks for that and for that acknowledgement of country, Colleen. So I'm living in Cairns and in Queensland, Australia, and there's a number of traditional owners across these lands. And yeah, always was, always will be Aboriginal land, and it's unceded sovereign territories. I work in psychiatry. I've been doing that for the last 2 years. And previously I was in Central Australia, and I think got burnt out by working in a racist system in psychiatry, and kind of being part of that structural racism in psychiatry, and seeing the impact that that had on individual clinical encounters. And so what I'm going to do next year, well, I've just submitted an application for a PhD to kind of explore that and write about that. So I'm at the start of my journey with Frantz Fanon. I've kind of read a little bit here and there. But yeah, this is the beginning, and I'm really excited to hear what you guys are going to be talking about today.
Cool. Thanks again for joining us. Sanjana?
Hi everyone, I'm Sanjana. I'm not from med school. I work as an associate scientist in a pharmaceutical company. I'm Janeet's friend. I was interested in this talk because I feel like I'm growing up. I am more interested in learning about myself and the world, and a lot of different things are going around. So just want to educate myself and contribute in some way. So I'm excited to be a part of this talk, and thank you.
Thanks for joining us, my friend Sanjana. Dr. Manji seemed very excited to join us, and he has not been able to log on yet. I sent him an email. Maybe he'll hop on in a little bit, but nevertheless, yeah, I don't want to like assume like a captainship of like this conversation in any kind of like permanent or material capacity. But I thought I would kind of try to kick it off. Hi, is that Jenny that just joined us? Okay, well, maybe, oh, okay. Could you just introduce yourself real quick, Jenny? If you're in a place where you can turn your camera on and say hi. Okay, that's fine. I'll just introduce her. She's a second-year psychiatry resident at the University of Illinois Hospital. And we just met while I was doing a rotation there. She's awesome. Okay, so I was thinking well, the first chapter is called Concerning Violence. And I feel like, you know, I know very little compared to Dr. Howard, Dr. Turner, Dr. Gordon, but something that I was, as I was like journaling last night, the following fell onto the page. Fanon's concerns are primarily ontological. He's concerned with matter before force, with shape before name, with conflict before narrative, and with life before God. And I feel like, yeah, the Hegelian strands do very much come across and are difficult to dismiss. But I think that before we dive into the ontology, we have to kind of like situate the relevance of the colonialism and the colonial context of his writing, and to what extent colonialism is relevant today. And I feel like for most, it's like a thing of the past, unless like you live in American Samoa or Puerto Rico. For like most, for most people who live in the United States, I think if you went up to them and you told them that there is some kind of colonial relationship established between you and the powers that be, they would be like, what? So I was wondering if maybe we could start by just exploring to what extent you believe colonialism is relevant if you are a citizen living in comfort in an imperialist state.
Which of us are you asking?
Anyone who has who would like to comment on that, or anyone who would wish to take the conversation in a different direction if you think that this starting point is not the best.
Well, maybe one of the comrades. What are your thoughts on that question?
I actually, bizarrely enough, I was going to open with a quote from Fanon's dissertation, which strangely enough speaks exactly to what you just said, Janeet. He says the human is, I guess this also connects with Lewis. The human is human insofar as they are entirely turned toward the future. We will have the occasion in a book we have been working on for some time, we assume that's Black Skins, to approach the problem of history from a psychoanalytic and ontological angle. We will then show that history is nothing but the systematic valorization of collective complexes. That's in, you can find that in Alienation and Freedom. They reproduce the dissertation. When I read that, just a whole bunch of lights went on in my head. I'd been working through Fanon's clinical papers for a few years, but I hadn't read the dissertation until Alienation and Freedom came out. And I'd already evolved in my thinking. You know, most of us come to Fanon from a political lens of the 1960s and 70s and the Black Power movement. And Fanon is situated in that context for much of the engagements with his work. But the clinical papers and the dissertation made me think that maybe we've been looking at this entirely wrong, in the sense that we thought that his politics informed his psychiatry, when in fact I think it's the psychiatry that informed the politics. It's the psychiatry that is political. And in fact, he says in, I think, the first clinical papers on experimenting with sociotherapy on a Muslim men's ward, I think Alice Turkey has it, that the experiment failed. I call it a creative failure. He was constantly doing that, but he's also making a political point. And I guess he was talking to one of the residents who he had worked with, or someone else. I don't think it was the one who he'd worked with on the study. And in responding to why he thought it had failed, is that he said that psychiatry has to be political. Psychiatry has to be political. And it was the idea of trying to institute sociotherapy, which is a sociotherapy from St. Albans and in a very progressive clinic that was started by his mentor, Francois Tasquales, and his attempt to really implement that in a Muslim context. And it failed. Now, mind you, socialist prime minister, who was essentially the home secretary at the time of the Algerian Revolution, Francois Mitterrand, was the one who said, Algeria is France. And here, in his own way, Fanon had demonstrated that French culture, sociotherapy, couldn't be implemented in a Muslim men's ward in Algeria. And so through psychiatry, as he said, psychiatry has to be political. And it called into question, and that's the thing I got in my reading this time. You get so many different things on chapter 1 of Wretched of the Earth, is the concept of the notion of how he believed revolution calls not just colonialism into question. He kept using the expression calls into question, calls into question, calls into question. And each time he talks about calling into question, it's the process of decolonization, which is calling colonialism into question, calling what it is to be human into question, calling all of these things into question, just different aspects of colonial society, including, I think, what you were getting at, the notion of how is colonialism thought of, or could it be thought of in terms of today? And certainly one of the fundamental characteristics of colonialism, as discussed by people like, Robert Blauner from back in the 70s, who was one of the first people to talk about internal colonialism, is the notion of occupation. Whether a community is occupied by a dominant or domineering violent force. And I don't think we'd have to convince most people on this call about Black communities in the United States being occupied territories. And so that's not the only characteristic of colonialism, but the question of occupation is one of those aspects. Camille Ropsis, in one of the essays in the book I co-edited, talked about Tasquales and the St. Albans psychiatrist focusing the idea of institutional therapy or sociotherapy on disoccupation of the mind, disoccupation of the psyche. And I would argue that Fanon was doing that in the sense of decolonizing the colonial psyche as well. So again, his dissertation goes right to, in some sense, I believe, the point that that you're raising about ontology and the idea that history is the valorization of collective complexes.
There's several things that come to mind immediately from the question you posed. And I'm just gonna just touch on some of them, and hopefully they would be illuminating. The first one I want to say right away is connected to the dissertation, which was on Friedreich ataxia. And the Fanon had originally presented Peau Noire Masse Blanche, Black Skin, White Mass, as his dissertation, but the psychiatrists he was working with were all positivist psychiatrists. And positivist psychiatrists, they had as a project the reduction of mental illness to neurological illness. And so they were not interested in a text like Black Skin, White Mass. And so, believe it or not, Fanon sat down and 2 weeks later gave them something else, which was the dissertation that enabled him to be Dr. Fanon. Now, it may seem like that was remarkable, but it turns out Fanon was, as Lou said, was always doing more than one thing at the same time. And so throughout his residency, he was constantly checking on people who were dealing with neurological illnesses, because Fanon, and this is also connected to his work that he was doing as a philosopher with Merleau-Ponty and others, which was that Fanon was critical of the idea that mental illness was reducible to neurological illness. And so he wanted to demonstrate the distinction. And this is one of the reasons he decided to focus on a degenerative neurological illness and to look at the different patients to find out if, although they may share neurological illness, what his dissertation showed is that the people suffering from Friedreich's ataxia, not all of them suffered from mental illness. And he was trying, and in Peau Noire Masse Blanche, in Black Skin, White Mass, he had an argument for why. So I'll come back to the argument for why, but to get to your question from before, Fanon's work is actually a critique of ontology, but it's a critique of ontology from an insight that is in existentialism. And but it's not that he took it from there. He already saw it concretely. And what the insight is one that's shared not only by Fanon and various existentialists he met in Martinique and in France, but it's also shared across the globe by, for instance, Eastern existentialists, whether it be Nishitani or people like Aurobindo. And what it is this, and this is something that many people don't realize. The sine qua non of Western philosophical thought is to reduce reality to being. And that's why ontology is so prominent. However, what non-Western thought basically offers as a criticism is that being covers over reality. In other words, reality is something broader than being. And once we understand this, we begin to, you could already see the structure there, because if you want to reduce reality to being, you'll have to impose upon reality a form of imperial straitjacket. So already at the ontological level, Fanon is observing the logic of colonialism, which is to place it, which is to disempower others through dominating them with a power relation that closes off their possibilities. So once we see this, what Fanon was showing in Peau Noire Masse Blanche, but in many writings, is that the goal of colonialism is to be ontological. But what Fanon showed is that despite that effort, the understanding of human beings in relational terms always exceeded the ontological categories. So if we want to think about an example of this, he goes to great length to give a critique of Lacanian psychoanalysis. But not only Lacanian psychoanalysis, he's actually given a critique of a lot of human sciences, which comes back to Lou's point about psychiatry, because psychiatry is a human science. And ultimately what he points out is that the big error of a lot of Western human science is that they start from an ontological premise in which they attempt to squeeze the human being into that order of things, rather than adjust the logic of their science to the human being. And so once we begin to see this, this is why Fanon pointed out that certain categories in Lacanian psychoanalysis fall apart when you look at Mayed Capacia, this is in Black and White Mass, or you look at Jean Venus, because he argued you could only understand why they upset the categories if you bring in the fact that they live in a world of colonialism. And to understand this, then we could think about it, and this is in La Damnée de la Terre, the damned of the earth, or the wretched of the earth. And what that is most people look at their society as good, as just, as the way things are. However, what they don't pay attention to when they look at their societies in that way is that there was a time that a lot of what they take for granted didn't exist. There was a time in which most of the institutions that we see today didn't exist, and that these institutions were created actually for the purposes of structuring a world in which there would be the colonizers and the colonized. So if we were to look at, say, we walk around the United States today, many people don't pay attention to the fact that the United States institutions of power, not only the government institutions, but its institutions of cultivating the human being, whether they're education, religious institutions, many medical institutions, we can go through all kinds of cooperative entities. Many of them were actually designed for the purpose of cultivating a world that's a binary in which one group of people are universally positive and anything outside of them would be the universal negative. In other words, a world of contraries. But what Fanon was pointing out is that the human world, because it's not ontological, in fact, existence means to stand out, is to go beyond the ontological. It means the human world is fundamentally dialectical, which means the human world is to deal with contradictions. So a lot of colonialism is to block the capacity of people to interact and communicate. And this leads to just two more points, and I'll stop. The first one is why Fanon is very careful with his language. He makes a distinction between a client and a patient. And that's because when somebody comes to Fanon, he doesn't start with the presumption that they're unhealthy or they're ill. If somebody comes to you and says, I'm suffering, I'm angry, I'm hurt, and you ask why, and you find out it's because I'm degraded at my job, I'm treated inferior the moment people look at me as black or brown. If I'm a woman, the presupposition that my function has to be sexually reductive, or the idea that if I just simply walk on the streets, for the police officers, I appear as a crime. My anger, then, Fanon would say, is legitimate. So that person for Fanon is not a sick person, that's actually a person who needs a positive channel for anger, which for Fanon is political action. However, a genuinely ill person is a different matter. And this is one of the reasons why the dissertation is so important. Because one of the things you'll find in a lot of Fanon's writings is that he identifies mental illness as not exclusively, but for the most part, locked in narcissism. In other words, some of the people with Friedreich's ataxia are concerned about how to communicate with others and in the midst of a debilitating disease. Whereas some people may say, no, I don't care about the disease. I just care that it's happening to me. And that is the beginning of a different relationship to illness. And so the last part, and you could see how this works out because, for instance, under enslavement, for instance, there was, as we know, in American psychiatry, an illness called drapetomania. And drapetomania was the illness of an enslaved person seeking freedom. So you have to think about what a society is like to call you mentally ill for wanting to be free. But the last part I just give it a simple joke. There's a fish that was caught in a net and brought on the shore on the deck, and the fish is gasping to breathe. And the fisherman or fisherwoman said, "Oh, this is not the fish we want." So they throw the fish back into the sea. So the poor fish now is swimming down as far as it can away from this horrible experience and past a school of other fish. Now, at this point, the fish says to the other fish, "How's the water?" And the other fish don't say anything. So the fish continues going. And after a while, the other fish looks at the other fish and say, "What's water?" Well, in a way, that question you ask is like asking what's water. Because you see what many of us, especially with the allegory of quarantining, breathing, and in Fanon's writing, by the way, the concept of breathing is throughout. There's nothing Fanon writes without referring to breathing. And if you think about what we're witnessing with not only what happened in Minnesota, but what happened in Staten Island and countless examples, but also if you look at African-American and Afro-Caribbean literature, you will find from Du Bois to Antonia Fairman, all the way back, even as early as people like Lemuel Haynes, there's a reference to breath. So this question about being, you see, the fish had to be in a place it could breathe. In a way, what he's saying is that humanity is going through an experience like being placed in context in which ultimately we will no longer be able to breathe. I'm done.
By the way, that went viral with actually back to with Garner, but also obviously with George Floyd. You see it on street art all over the world now. I saw a mural in Syria, in bombed out Syria, of George Floyd and "I Can't Breathe" in Fanon. I mean, it's incredible. And the quote is from Black Skin, White Mask. He was actually referring to the Vietnamese struggle, which is, we don't revolt for any particular culture, although it's been truncated. We revolt simply because we can no longer breathe. We can also find breathing in chapter 1 of Dying Colonialism, Algeria Unveiled. He relates it to women as revolutionaries. He talks about a combat breathing where people prepare to revolt.
And
so, right. By the way, Fanon references Joseph Breuer, who was, I guess, the mentor to Freud. And apparently there is a breathing reflex named after Breuer. And the Herring-Breuer reflex, which when you take air into your lungs, there's a reflex that keeps them from going totally full, and there's a reflex that pulls them back, and it's called the Herring-Breuer reflex. So, and Fanon apparently obviously studied Breuer in and constitutional psychiatry very closely. And that's part of his critique of Lacan.
Yeah, and if we come back to that question about psychiatry, you could see one of the main things for all of you as physicians is that if you make the transition from a client to a patient, your task is to make the patient healthy.
Okay.
But and this is where Fanon is really interesting in many ways, because the question Fanon is in fact asking, let's say he took the person who came in and says, I'm angry at racism, colonialism, etc., and tries to treat him. In other words, not look at him as a client or her, but as a patient now. The obscenity, Fanon argued, was the task of psychiatry to make that person at home with her degradation or his degradation. So that meant that orthodox psychiatry, or what he was learning, was ultimately structurally a colonial practice of trying to create the happy slave.
Right.
And so what Fanon argues, what actually said to these people is, you know, you're angry because you're healthy. That's the crucial point. And this, of course, meant Fanon had to get a coherent notion of what it means not to be healthy. And this is where a lot of his writing becomes even more radical, because you see, he's writing in a context in what dominates political thought and human sciences, liberalism, liberal in the philosophical sense. The liberal philosophical theory isolates the individual as if the individual can be a human being all in her or his own. And within that framework, tries to treat the world as if certain norms by themselves can have the result, for instance, justice or morality. But what Fanon noticed, and not only in those writings, but many of his writings, including some of the lectures he gave at the Black Writers Congress in Paris in 1954, but also what he did later on in 56 and 59. What Fanon, in different places, but what Fanon began to question is a very provocative question, which is whether you could meet all the criteria of justice in a society, but still be unhealthy, because the very system of justice is premised upon the normalization of dehumanization. So, and this is what many Black people, for instance, face in the United States, because you see, if you go in the criminal justice system, there are all these rules, but in the end, they don't mean anything if that structural system blocks your appearance as a human being. So that gives you, that relates to the question you asked.
I want to make a space for anyone else to say something if they want at this point before I offer a couple of points in response to what you said.
Can I say a couple of things? Thank you very much. I've been taking a lot of notes. I'm really enjoying this conversation. I think, you talked about kind of the, Dr. Russell, I think the global response to George Floyd's death. And I was reflecting on the movements that happened in Australia for First Nations lives, and how, a lot of the commentary from First Nations folks was that why does it take something happening overseas to recognize what is happening in our own country? And I think it shows a level of dehumanization that people here face. And I always bring that back to, people are not willing to kind of reckon with the colonial violence that has happened in this country that is so deep-seated, and that, it requires kind of turning around like the whole existence of what colonial Australia is, and kind of reckoning with the fact that, the privileges that we have and the way that we live is kind of directly off the back of that. And it's such a common thing, like for First Nations issues here, they say, when like people go overseas, they kind of treated more as more human than in their own country. So that was kind of one thought that I had. And then the other one was that I think this was Dr. Gordon, you talked about what Frantz Fanon says about psychosis and kind of how, I'm not sure if you talked about this, but I think about this a lot, how, how can you, psychosis about someone not being within, like having a fractured state of reality, but how can you bring back someone to reality if they're living in a colonized country? Or if the country remains occupied. And I've thought about that a lot in my work that I've done, and kind of like where to from here. And I guess, you talk about the difference between, that Fanon differentiates between mental illness and justified anger and rage at colonial occupation. And I think about the in-between, where I see, like, in people who might be experiencing psychotic symptoms, for example, but that stuff still comes out, like that that anger, and how to kind of reconcile the two and make space. And I don't know, I don't have any answers, but they're just some of my thoughts. Thanks for listening.
Actually, I wanted to say to you and Colleen, because you guys are in Australia, in our book on Fanon's psychotherapeutic approaches to clinical work, we actually have a contribution from a psychiatric nurse who works in Australia and Torres Straits, First Nations people. It's a very interesting piece. And it's like the third person I've come across in Australia who's a psychiatric nurse who's written on Fanon. And there must be a movement over there, because I mean, it was just, they kind of stand out. There's these articles by psychiatric nurses using Fanonian psychotherapy, and all three of them are in Australia. So you might want to check it out. I don't know what's going on.
Yes, some of it is
I
connected.
definitely will.
We could keep in touch if you'd like to look at some references. But yeah, there's been a long history of this. And some of it comes, you may notice when I wrote my first book, Bad Faith and Anti-Black Racism, I'd opened up actually with a poem that was from an Indigenous Australian to point out the way the category Black is used in Australia. And there were varieties of movements in Australia with different Indigenous groups, including query groups, because I've gone there and spoke with them. Only once when I went to Australia, it wasn't through the invitation of an Indigenous person. It was always Indigenous peoples inviting me. And the varieties of communities who have been, there's a body of literature. There was also a wonderful volume that was put together by people from not only the Straits, but also from other parts of the country, around looking at how one talks about race and indigeneity, in which Fanon's writings were very prominent. The thing that, of course, is that Australia has multiple academies. It in effect has, the White Academy, but a lot of people are unaware that there is another academy that is ongoing, that's with the ground level grassroots activists who are connected to questions of ongoing struggles for change. And they all read Fanon, and others, but particularly Fanon.
I just wanted to chime in, speaking of poetry. I'm a poetry fan myself, and what you were mentioning, Dr. Gordon, about the I can't breathe aspect. There's a really wonderful poem by a Black American poet, Ross Gay, called A Small But Needful Fact. I'll share it in the chat, but he
was my former student.
Oh, he was, okay. Yeah, it's a great poem inspired by Eric Garner. So yeah, I recommend it to everyone.
Yeah, my Skype site has me back in 2015 with a big T-shirt that just says "I can't breathe," referred to Garner. And there are many, many examples. But I think Howard had his hand up too. Yeah.
Well, I wanted to again thank you for your very illuminating comments. I want to say two things. One is that the contradiction of clinical practice that you mentioned in terms of healthy people being angry and that being a source of revolutionary transformation applies not only in psychiatry, but really across the board in healthcare, and actually across the board in, I feel, all the service professions. And I've actually faced this contradiction every day in clinical practice, and I've taught about it, written about it, done research about it, how difficult it is actually to do that in clinical practice. That is to say, you're suffering because you're healthy, because the suffering is so deep that, and the for many, the places to go are so few in terms of connection, that people are often mostly wanting some dulling of the pain. And that's what we're being asked for as practitioners. And this is, I think, is one of the most difficult contradictions in clinical practice. How to respond to a client who actually is experiencing a very healthy response to oppression. So I just wanted to reinforce what you were saying, and it might be something that we could talk about in another context, about strategies to deal with that, because Fanon's insights, I think, are very, very important today. The second point I wanted to mention is I'd actually encourage people, I want to encourage people to think about this moment in terms of Fanon's very passionate writings about revolution, because don't we live in a revolutionary moment now? And in other sessions of this group, we're considering some work that I've been doing and others on what constitutes revolution right now. How can we actually do it? It's very easy to analyze these, well, it's not easy, but relatively easy to analyze these horrendous problems that we face. It's much more difficult to put our imaginations around a strategy of revolutionary change, and then to actually walk that path in terms of our day-to-day praxis of actually bringing about that revolution. So I just wanted to encourage people to perhaps direct our focus to that question in this discussion, because from my point of view, we don't have much time left. I've shared before with the group, I used to feel that, well, I can do as much as I can. Probably I'll have to leave it to the next generation. I don't feel that way anymore. I feel that the crisis is so profound now, and the opportunities so profound for revolutionary transformation, that we really can't defer this any longer. Thank you.
To those amazing comments. Howard and I at some point talked about the patient who comes to the clinic who says they have depression, and the question of whether they are depressed because they have some kind of thing that needs to be treated, say pharmacologically, could be treated pharmacologically, versus the person who is not really depressed, but rather is experiencing what a human would and should experience in a brutalized place. And what first came to mind then, and I would like to offer here is that to the person who is seeking help in this asymmetric transaction of power, is it for the more powerful person to say that you need to, or that I encourage you to acknowledge that this is in fact a healthy response? Or is it in fact the duty of that practitioner to say, okay, here's what I can offer you. If it makes you feel better, then you can decide later if you want to take revolutionary action to change your circumstances or not. And that is my way of kind of like responding to what was said about ontology and dialectics, and that if we can say to the patient who comes to the clinic from a brutalized place in despair that no, your reaction is a healthy response, are we not positing an ontology in that we are saying that ontologically that place is brutalized? And is that, or am I just confused, which is also very, very possible. And then I wanted to also comment on this idea of the occupied mind, because I think that that idea is probably the most relevant for, or one of the most relevant, sorry, for healthcare practitioners, especially physicians in the US, where we are very much trained with this dogmatic ideology that patients are sources of value, essentially, and that the hospital is fundamentally a marketplace. And but at the same time, Fanon decries the Western glorification of subjectivity and the total and wistful immersion in one's own subjectivity. And so what I wonder is, how can you take upon the project of decolonization of your mind without falling into the trap of radical immersion and into a useless subjectivity?
Well, the first thing is that what Fanon would say is that colonialism is a socio-historical reality. And you notice I said reality, right? Not ontology. It's not simply about being. So that's the first thing. And he would say that part of the anger was ultimately, most anger is anger ultimately at the self. And so ultimately, even though it's looked at the world at first, there is this problem of a sense of inability to act, this notion of a lack of agency. And that creates a form of helplessness that leads to certain forms of suffering. In a lot of my writings, I call that impulsivity. The other thing that related to actually your first question is that we need a richer understanding of how we understand colonialism, because we often think about colonialism simply as the soldiers coming in, they take over, they set up a colonial state, etc. But what colonialism also is the imposition of putting the human being out of relationships. And Fanon calls it depersonalization. And what this involves is a particular metaphysics, when this is back to the ontology thing, in which the person functions like an individual substance, almost like a god on her or his own. But that dialectical argument I made earlier is about a relational understanding, which means, and Fanon, by the way, took structuralism very seriously, which is that you're part of a system of the production of meanings. And so what Fanon would begin with saying, because meaning actually transcends ontology, what he would say is that you're encountering a world that tries to collapse you into meaninglessness. In other words, into a thing. And that part of the creative and effective aspect of being able to be actional, Fanon would add, is to try to find a way to act without investing narcissistic conceptions of action in there. The narcissistic conception is to act like that individual can just go out there and make the revolution happen. But what Fanon would say is if you understand things relationally, that you're part of something greater than yourself, the issue, all that's needed for action is to understand what your part is. And this is one of the reasons why I think I've argued he focuses so much on a critique of narcissism, because the narcissist is unsatisfied with the idea of having a role. The narcissist wants to believe that he or she is the role. And if you look at a lot of racism, a lot of what's produced in Euromodern colonialism, one of the things that Fanon pointed out is that it's unhealthy for a group of people to be raised with the idea that they're superior to all other people. But it's funny, just to give you an example, I was having a conversation with a doctoral student where she was working through semiological feminist psychoanalysis. And as she was bringing up all kinds of examples that she was treating as ontological, sexual difference, things like those, I asked her a question. I said, I asked her to describe not individual white people she may know, as friends, but describe white people as a structure. When she thinks of white people as a structure, what goes through her mind? And it was very interesting. Then I asked her to look at the Mayo Clinic's list of symptoms of malignant narcissism. And she immediately cracked up because everything she described was on that list. The world is for you. If you don't get everything you want, then you're victimized. You're superior to all others. And the list just goes on and on. Everything's about you. If you look at the logic of how white supremacy functions, white supremacy is the cultivated normalization of narcissism among white people. And Fanon just outright said that, back in 1952. And so if we come back to this is the part, you see, I have a debate with a group called Afro-Pessimists, because they took a lot of my writings and tried to claim that I'm claiming the Black is ontological and all of this stuff. And I said, no. The anti-Black racism wants to make the world anti-Black. The reason the world isn't anti-Black is because Black people and many other groups of people have been fighting from day one against that idea of reality. And so, in other words, there are roles for many of us to play. And part of it comes to one last point I'd make. One thing, and Lou may have noticed this as well, that Fanon brings this up. He not only wrote journal articles, but he also created journals inside the clinics where the health practitioners would work with each other to work out their limitations. And in these journals, one of the things Fanon observed is that one of the fundamental things to develop in the interaction with the patient in the way you just mentioned is the art of listening. And that is because one of the things that colonialism cultivates is a form of epistemic or psychological dependency. And so meeting a physician who exemplifies humility stimulates something in the patient about trying to learn how to take responsibility for the transformation of her or his condition as well. You got to turn on your mic, Lou. You got to turn on your mic.
I said that in the journal that they reproduce in Alienation and Freedom, he has this very powerful, very beautiful passage that's reminiscent of George Floyd narrating his own death as he calls for his deceased mother. And Fanon says in the journal, this is the journal that he started in the clinic, he's asking the question, when we are in distress, why do we call for our mother? And it's just, it's like, it's almost poetic, the way he explains why people in distress call for their mother, and whether they're, in pain after surgery or when they're dying. And he goes on and on talking about why we call for our mothers. And it's like George Floyd all over again, essentially, as I said, narrating his death and calling for his deceased mother. It's a Quaker meeting.
Just waiting to see if anyone else has anything they want to say.
Yeah, I mean, so there's this one, going back to your original question, Janith, like what should like the physician who is sort of, revolutionary minded do when a patient comes in with complaints that we can either like medicate away or like say are justified, I think is a really, really complicated question, right? Because, and I think this really ties into what Dr. Gordon was speaking about, this question of like narcissism. And I want to like introduce a term that I very only recently learned about, called adventurism. So, and like basically like adventurism is the idea, I think, is sort of like the pragmatic consequence of the narcissism that Dr. Lewis, like very elegantly pointed out, that like for the person who is doing the activity, like it's not enough that they have a role, but they have the role. And so what they end up doing is they try to form some kind of like ostensibly revolutionary movement, but that has no real support among the masses, but really only exists to like sate their own ego or their own particular ideals. And they lead the people, like lead their small group of followers off into, some kind of adventure, right? And that inevitably ends in disaster, right? And so I think in that situation, the real question isn't what we should do, but what is the person who is approaching us really saying, right? Like, I think it's important for us to really evaluate what is the role that has been given to us by the people who are seeking our help, right? Like, are they looking for us to like tell them, yeah, like now is the time to overthrow everything, like, like meet here and get ready to like sack this police station or whatever? But or are they really asking, like, look, just help me get through this day, like help me get through the week? I think you can make gentle nudges in like either direction, right? You can totally say to a guy like, yes, you absolutely meet all the clinical criteria for depression as defined by the DSM-5, but your life has inevitably led you to this point because of your role in society and what the system is doing. So it's not, I don't think this question is really something that anybody can answer. I think, as Dr. Lewis said, it's our responsibility to be humble, to listen, and and provide education whenever possible. But ultimately, this decision on like which way to like push people, I don't really feel like is totally ours to make.
I hate to jump in again, but Dr. Firoze Manji just joined us, and he's kind of a rock star. So I was hoping if, you know, we're in like our last few minutes, maybe you could just say a little bit about who you are, where you're at, what your relationship to Fanon is. And then if you would like to comment on kind of like what we've been talking about, which has mostly been, you know, what is the relevance of colonialism today, and how does it relate to the work of healthcare practitioners in the modern context?
Wow, that's a lot of questions, and that's the first time I've ever been called a rock star. Okay, I'm originally from Kenya, but currently in Canada, in the forests up in Quebec. My connection with Fanon is really related to who's behind me. Do you recognize him? That is Amilcar Cabral. Cabral is, for me, the epitome of an organic intellectual, an intellectual who, as an agronomist, became a revolutionary and led a revolution in Guinea-Bissau and transformed the liberated zones, 2/3 of Guinea-Bissau, and transformed social relations there, transformed the way in which healthcare was determined, the way in which villages organized, how democracy operated, how women got involved, how people were listened to. But it's very clear to me that Fanon had that Cabral had a profound understanding of Fanon, and I think built on some of the ideas that Fanon developed. And in particular, I think his view that it is a serious mistake to think that we can simply take over the colonial state. It's like saying we can build hospitals using a tank. Well, you know, a tank is built for one thing, hospitals for something else. And he argued very strongly for the need to burn down, to reduce to ashes the colonial state, because it was built specifically for control, specifically for using violence, the structures of violence, the police, the army, and so on, to control the native. And it is impossible to use a machinery that is built for that to provide freedom and liberation, emancipation for the population, for the people. And I think his understanding of the need to defend the gains of the revolution was absolutely central and required, unfortunately, it required the use of arms because they were faced by a genocidal colonial regime, and they used you used arms to defend the revolution. It wasn't the use of violence. And I think it is because of his profound understanding of the importance of love and the need to protect any gains of that love, which was central, I think. And that's something that Fanon actually understood, and I think is grossly misunderstood, that in fact his writings about violence, which everyone in the sort of right-wing media portrays, actually was an expression of love, an expression of what violence does to the colonized. And it is out of love and an understanding of the situation that Black people are driven to that requires an understanding of what violence is about. It was a rejection, not an acceptance of violence. It was an understanding that it was no other way in which the exploited, the oppressed, the colonized could respond on that. It's not a justification, but a profound understanding and listening. It comes from a deep understanding of listening to what the colonized actually suffered. I just end by saying that I think we have a tendency often to talk about the post-colony. And I'd like to reject this idea. We are still colonized, whether we live in the north or in the south. We are still colonized. That is to say, unless we have the capacity to determine our future, to organize, to emancipate ourselves, if we do not have that, we remain within the colonial domain, okay? And it's a continuity. There is no post-coloniality. There is a continuity, albeit in new structures, etc. But they are just replications of the chiefdoms and so on that many of us in the Global South have experienced. Indeed, Global South, indeed, indigenous populations here in Canada suffer exactly the same. So let me stop at that point.
Thank you so much. That was great. So I do want to honor people's time. Real quick, if you want to receive invitations to these kinds of things in the future, just pop your email into the thing and I'll add you to the listserv. But I don't feel very qualified to offer any kind of closing remarks because of my ignorance. Is there anyone who would like to kind of give us something to reflect on as we part ways?
I guess we could each say something. First, I want to say thank you for organizing this. It's wonderful to get to spend time with you all, and also, as I said, to traverse the limits of I hate the fact neoliberalism calls it social distancing, you know, but it's physical distancing, and we find a way to use the technology to communicate and have social closeness. The thing I like to say is the other day I was arguing with someone that it led me to just put a simple tweet. And the tweet was that life isn't a skill, it's a commitment. And the point about it is something linked in that is often misunderstood about Fanon, because a lot of people want to work within a framework of knowing the outcome before the performance. But if that's what our ancestors who face challenges, sometimes even worse than many of us, that makes it completely a mystery how they were able to act, because there's no way they could know the outcome. And that's an insight about political action, that that it's ultimately about the commitment, because in that commitment, you realize you're struggling for something greater than yourself. In other words, the political struggle, the quest is not really what it is for you. Political life is always about us, the we, but that also means not simply about us here and now, but it also transcends time, paradoxically, both in terms of ancestors and descendants, and also those who may be so radically different that they're not recognizable to us in the way we think about being human. And this connects to some of what Howard was saying at the beginning, because there's certain decisions that we make out of commitment for things that we understand need to be done. And although we may not see the promised land, we may not get the immediate rewards, the fact of the matter is we can live with ourselves each day through acting on that commitment. So I just wanted to state that, and perhaps some of the others would like to say something.
Hey, I would like to thank Janit for inviting me and catching up on and catching Firoze's podcast where we spoke. It was very invigorating. I think I'll just end again. I'll get my second quote in. Since you guys are students of psychiatry, I wanted to read a quote from Fanon's mentor. Long after Fanon had passed away, I think it's probably in the 1975 or something, and he was asked to his view of Fanon and what Fanon went on to do. And Pasquale said, "What is the space of madness? What are the limits of the field of professional action of psychiatrists? Where do we exercise said action of mental hygiene, even therapy? The quote unquote sick attend, participate, and are outside the hospital. Families of the sick as well. What we have said was, here is a sector, an extension of psychiatry. You will see the risks. Fanon has consumed his life in that risk of going outside of the clinic."
Saw you, Dr. Howard.
Again, I want to express my deep gratitude to those who are participating, not only the presenters, but it's so exciting and it's thrilling actually to witness a different generation with the kinds of commitments and concerns that are present on this call. So I wanted to congratulate you all for that. I just wanted to, I guess, close from my end by problematizing violence. This has been a concern for me since my earliest years, because I was influenced by my house painter, organizer grandfather, who was actually a war resister and deserter from the Tsar's army to actually become a conscientious objector. And so I've been personally confronting issues of violence and revolution since I was a kid. I had actually felt that this was a fact, that violence was inevitable if there were going to be revolution. But actually over time, this whole area has become much more problematized for me, partly because the successful the successful violent revolutions have actually not done very well, with certain exceptions. Perhaps Cuba is one. The communist way of looking at this is that Vietnam won the war and then lost it to the World Bank and International Monetary Fund. So I just wanted to mention that there's quite a lot of evidence now that revolutionary change actually can be brought about non-violently. And it might be good actually in a subsequent meeting to read some of that evidence. It's actually quite striking. It's based on empirical research, for instance, in the dictatorships of Latin America and how those were changed through revolutionary nonviolent action and the withdrawal of consent from the dictatorial state. And so Fanon's very moving description, which is, in my experience, completely accurate of the experience of violence from the oppressor, still doesn't mean we can't problematize whether our acting violently ultimately is necessary. Why is this important? Because of what I said earlier, the importance of acting now in an organized way, that we find a path to bring about the revolutionary transformation that's so urgently needed. So again, I want to thank everyone and would welcome feedback on
that. Dr. Manji, would you like the last word?
First, I must apologize for having been late on this. I think my understanding of time zones is a bit out of phase. I'll soon get used to being in North America. I just posted a quick note to say that Howard has actually written a really interesting pamphlet on what he calls, I guess it's a North American expression, rinky-dink revolution, but it's an everyday revolution. What we can do to transform the world as we live and the way we live. So I've sent a link to this excellent pamphlet. I really would like to thank you for having organized. I think it's a tremendous initiative, and I really am sorry that I wasn't able to participate in the discussions that preceded this. But we have a small pamphlet coming out shortly by Nigel Gibson called Fanon and the Rationality of Revolt. And he argues there, based on Fanon's writings, that revolt is a fundamentally necessary consequence of the nature of colonial oppression. And colonial oppression, as I said earlier on, is a continuity of what capitalism organizes. And I think it is what you've initiated here is very, very important, because it is an expression of not only the rationality of revolt, but the necessity of revolt. And I think what you've organized here is an expression of, it's a manifestation of revolt that is necessary and is part of who we are and what we need to do.
Thank you so much, Dr. Manji and Dr. Gordon and Dr. Turner, Howard, and everyone else. Sorry for going over a little bit. I feel very grateful to have shared this with you. I feel like I learned a bunch. And I hope that at the very least you didn't feel that it was a waste of your time. If no one else has anything of utmost importance or pressing that they'd like to share, I just wanted to wish you all well in the days and lives to come. And if you have sent me your email, look forward to receiving invitations to future conversations. So with that, I will end this call, and I wish you all well.
Safety, health, and despite the difficult times, moments of joy. Ciao.
Joy indeed.